Welcome to another edition of Deeply Disturbing Stories. Today we are going to be talking about a person who had an encounter with their dead aunt. This was posted under the subreddit Paranormal Encounters by a user named This Is Not Abby. When I was 10 years old, my grandfather passed away, leaving the old family home to my mother and I. It was one of those old Victorian homes. It's been in the family for well over 100 years. The house came with a plot of land, and in the back was a forest of trees. Me being about 10 years old, with a huge imagination, decided it would be best to go exploring. As I was exploring, I ran into another girl. I say hello and ask her name, and asked her if she had lived around there. She said her name was Kay. She said her house was close to here. This made me happy to have another kid my age to play with. I asked her if she wanted to play. She agreed. From then on, for a whole year, Kay and I were best friends. We had played together every day after school and on weekends. The only problem was Kay only wanted to play in the forest. She didn't want to go anywhere else. But again, I was happy to have a friend, so I didn't question it. But then my grandfather got sick, and he was given less than a year to live. Our family moved back to be with him for his final days. He actually lived for a whole another year before we lost him. After a while, my parents and I moved back home. But when I got back, Kay never came over. Days went by, and then weeks, and then months, and no Kay. Eventually I moved on, figured she had moved away. It wasn't until 15 years later that I realized who Kay was. My parents decided to move into a retirement community and left the house to me and my fiance. About a week after moving in, I was going through some old family photos when I got to a picture of my mother, my grandfather, and my grandmother, and then another girl. That girl wasn't just any girl. It was Kay. I was sure of it. I was completely freaked out. I took the photo to my mom and I asked her to explain, not mentioning that she looked like my old friend. My mother sighed. She said she never wanted me to know, but our family had a dark past. The girl in the photo was Catherine, my mother's sister who went missing when she was 10 years old. No sign of her had ever been found, even over 20 years later. It was suspected that a family member who had committed suicide not long after her disappearance was at fault. This fucked me up for a while, and I tried my best to move on. But then we had the wildfires. They burned down most of the forest in our backyard. Thankfully, our house had suffered minimum damage, but the forest was toast. Literally. We decided to clear the land, which resulted in a terrifying find. While digging up one of the trees, one of the workers had found bones. Not just any bones, human bones. The police were called and they'd done an investigation, and they determined that the body found belonged to Catherine. They determined she did not die after she went missing. Is this why Kay only wanted to play in the trees? Could she not leave, or did she want me to find her body? And if so, why didn't she tell me? This next story comes to us from the user Trash-tastic Takeout under the subreddit True Scary Stories. I was about 11 years old when this happened. My older cousin Daniel was about 13. He and I were playing hide-and-go-seek out in my grandma's yard. She owned a large farm in Tennessee, just over 1,000 acres. He and I grew up there my entire life, so it was nothing for us to wander off and play in areas that probably weren't safe for us. But we knew the property like it was the back of our hand. It just so happened that day before this had happened, a lot of trees were cut down to make room for a new mobile home by the side of the road. She had intended to rent it out for extra income. Daniel and I naturally gravitated toward this new, unfamiliar landscape to play, because it was something new to explore, and all the trees had been stripped of their branches. They were placed in logging trucks and hauled away. The branches, however, were all piled up in a tangled mess about 50 feet wide, about 12 to 15 feet tall. They were packed so densely that you couldn't see through them from one side to the other. It was during about the half-hour mark when it was my turn to find Daniel that I began to suspect that he had began hiding in the woods deeper than our rules had stated aloud. I remember calling his name for several minutes and hearing nothing but a quiet giggle coming out of the woods. I was in the newly cut clearing looking into the woods and getting more upset by the minute. Finally, I announced as loudly as I could that if he weren't going to play fairly, that I was just going to go inside and get a glass of tea and watch some TV with my grandma. I started back up towards the hill towards the house. It was at this moment I was walking past the brush pile, basically centered beside it, that I heard an unfamiliar voice.
You gave up quickly.
I stopped. I called out, "Daniel?" It didn't sound like Daniel, but the voice responded,
Yes, I'm Daniel. I am. I'm inside the limbs.
I looked at the brush pile and didn't see anyone there. Again, I heard the odd voice call out,
If you don't see me, then you have not found me. And I will have won the game.
I stepped closer and yelled out to the voice,
Why are you talking so funny?
The voice replied,
I'm inside all the limbs. Look inside and you'll see me, Daniel.
Something felt really strange about the way this guy was talking, but 11-year-old me just rationalized it, thinking, maybe his voice sounded different because he was hiding in the shrubs. He sounded like he was talking funny because his voice just sounded a little different because it was coming through there. I stepped up to the edge of the brush pile and pulled the branches apart to look inside, and there was Daniel. His head was turned toward the top of the hill, but his body was facing me. I yelled out,
Ha! I caught you.
His head shifted toward me. He had the single most disgusting smile I'd ever seen to this very day. Imagine if someone had the absolute worst intentions, and they're trying to hide behind a fake innocent smile to gain your trust. But they couldn't help their glee with the thought that they may have just fooled you. That's the best way I can describe this smile. I was so shocked by this wicked facial expression on my cousin's face that I froze in place. The hairs on my neck and arms all raised, and I could suddenly feel my blood running through my body like the temperature had dropped inside of my veins. I stammered through my words.
How did you get in there?
He responded.
I fell into the inside of the limbs, cousin. I will need you to give me help, or I will continue to be trapped.
I began to notice how oddly he had phrased his sentences, and it had only occurred to me afterward that his lips were not moving when he had spoke. He never changed his face from the twisted, unnerving smile. I didn't immediately notice any of these things because I was too distracted by the large stick that was plunged deep inside of his neck. I noticed in that moment he had a slow, steady, trickling stream of blood flowing from the half-dollar sized stick in his neck and down across his right shoulder and across his chest. That was enough to jolt me to my feet awake, and before my brain realized I was trying to run, I was already halfway up the hill and to my grandmother's house. I burst through the door into my grandma's living room. Daniel was curled up in a ball, and on the couch he was crying hysterically. My grandmother was sitting beside him, trying her best to get him to explain what was wrong, but all he could say is that there was a little boy in the woods who had tagged him when he was hiding, and he thought it wasn't me. He wouldn't say anything else. I was crying. I was shaken up by this point. I told my grandma what I had seen. She had made both of us some lunch and then called my uncle to come pick Daniel up. I stayed at my grandmother's house that night, and I bet she asked me 100 times. She asked so many questions, it was as if she were committing it to memory. I remember being relieved that she believed me, but at the same time, I just wanted her to tell me that it was all in my imagination and try to help me forget about it. The next day, my grandma set the brush pile on fire. I watched for hours from the safety of the living room window as it slowly deteriorated into a pile of ash and ember. My cousin never did tell me to this day what really had happened to him. He refuses to talk about it. I will say this, though. He wouldn't talk to me for a year and a half after that. We were so close when we were little. That event, whatever the hell it was, it drove a wedge between us and changed our relationship forever.